When Kim Jong-un rewrites unification, what kind of future is he actually building? There's been a lot of chatter about North Korea officially ditching its unification goals after their recent constitutional changes. But this piece from War on the Rocks offers a really compelling alternative view. It argues that what looks like an abandonment is actually a strategic redefinition of how Pyongyang plans to achieve its long-standing ambitions. Understanding that nuance, especially with Kim Jong-un's consolidated nuclear authority, is crucial for how Washington and Seoul navigate the future of the peninsula. It really makes you rethink what's at play. Written by Hyun-Sung Lee in War on the Rocks. Narrated for Arva. Join War on the Rocks and gain access to content trusted by policymakers, military leaders, and strategic thinkers worldwide. When news broke that North Korea had revised its constitution, analysts in the West and across the Korean peninsula rushed to declare it the formal death of Korean reunification as a policy objective. The changes were hard to ignore. Pyongyang stripped all references to a unified Korean nation, codified a territorial clause treating the Republic of Korea as a separate foreign state, vested direct nuclear weapons authority in Kim Jong-un personally, and concentrated near-absolute executive power in the supreme leader alone. On the surface, it looked like the official burial of 7 decades of unification ideology. That reading is seductive. It's also almost certainly wrong, and dangerously so. North Korea's constitutional revisions are better understood not as an abandonment of its long-standing peninsula ambitions, but as a strategic redefinition of how those ambitions will be pursued. That distinction matters enormously. If Washington and Seoul misread Pyongyang's intentions here, they will miscalibrate the alliance's posture, deterrence architecture, and diplomatic options that will define Northeast Asian security for the next generation. To understand what Kim Jong-un is doing, one first must understand what he is walking away from and why. For decades, North Korea publicly advanced what it called the 3 principles of reunification: independence, peace, and national solidarity. Beneath that rhetorical packaging, the actual strategy was far more coercive. Drive a wedge between Seoul and Washington, cultivate pro-Pyongyang sentiment within South Korea's political left, and ultimately engineer the withdrawal of U.S. forces from the peninsula as the precondition for a favorable settlement. The slogans of Jungminjuk Dayanggyo, Grand National Unity, and Uri Minjakkiri, Among Our Nation, deployed widely from the 1970s through the 1990s, were never genuine invitations to dialogue. They were instruments of political warfare, precision-engineered to drive a wedge between South Korea and its most indispensable ally, the United States. That strategy failed. Decades of influence operations, covert pressure, and political maneuvering didn't fundamentally alter the peninsula's security architecture. U.S. forces remain, and the alliance deepened. Rather than drifting away from Washington, Seoul has emerged as one of America's most capable and indispensable partners in the Indo-Pacific. There is another dimension to this failure that rarely gets discussed in Western policy circles. South Korea's cultural influence, carried into North Korea via USB drives, smuggled DVDs, and radio waves, has been quietly dismantling the regime's propaganda architecture from within. Korean dramas, music, and consumer goods have given ordinary North Koreans something the state never anticipated: direct, unmediated evidence that the South is prosperous, that the regime has been lying, and that the world outside looks nothing like what they were taught. None of this is a mere abstraction for me. As a branch chair of the Kim Il-sung Socialist Youth League in Dalian, China, my job was to maintain ideological discipline, to ensure that young North Koreans abroad saw nothing and believed nothing that contradicted the regime's narrative. That architecture is now cracking from within, and no one understands better than those who built it how hard it is to repair once the cracks appear. What began as suspicion is hardening into conviction among a growing number of North Koreans. The soft power reunification strategy Pyongyang deployed against the South has, in an ironic reversal, been turned against it. Kim Jong-un has responded by replacing a strategy that failed with one he believes will succeed. The constitutional revisions should not be read in isolation. They ought to be understood together with 3 other developments: the 2022 nuclear use doctrine, the 2024 mutual defense treaty with Russia, and the systematic destruction of inter-Korean infrastructure and communication links, including the Arch of Reunification, a monument Kim's own father erected as a symbol of peninsular unity. Together, these moves do not signal a withdrawal from Korean peninsula politics. They signal a fundamental reset of the terms on which Pyongyang intends to dominate it. The most underappreciated element is the constitutional concentration of nuclear authority to Kim personally. By enshrining in the Constitution his exclusive right to authorize nuclear strikes, without consulting anyone, without institutional mediation, Pyongyang is signaling that nuclear weapons are no longer simply a deterrent against the United States or a bargaining chip in diplomatic negotiations.
They are now an offensive instrument available to Kim at his sole discretion in the Korean theater, with a lowered threshold for use. The 2022 Law on the State Policy on Nuclear Forces had already signaled as much, explicitly authorizing preemptive strikes against what the regime defines as existential threats to its survival. With the Constitution now layered on top, any remaining ambiguity over nuclear command, control, and employment has been effectively eliminated. Some analysts read Article 89 as codification of existing practice rather than a novel escalation, and in a narrow technical sense, they are right. But that reading mistakes the document for its context. Constitutional enshrinement means something that operational doctrine does not. It removes deniability, forecloses reversal, and changes the signaling environment for every actor watching Pyongyang. More importantly, this provision didn't arrive in isolation. It followed the codification of the 2022 Law on the State Policy on Nuclear Forces, Kim's December 2023 redefinition of inter-Korean relations as a relationship between hostile states, and his October 2024 declaration that nuclear use against South Korea couldn't be ruled out. Read in sequence, the inference that the threshold for use has been lowered is not a leap. It is the most direct reading of the evidence. This is the behavior of a state restructuring its coercive toolkit for the next phase of inter-Korean competition, not one settling for a permanent division. The formal designation of South Korea as a hostile state is similarly misread as evidence that Pyongyang has accepted permanent partition. History suggests otherwise. This isn't an exact analogy, but China has repeatedly stated its preference for peaceful reunification with Taiwan while refusing to renounce the use of force and simultaneously accelerating the military buildup required to make force credible, all while never abandoning its insistence on eventual unification under Beijing's terms. Soviet bloc states signed the Helsinki Accords, affirming European borders while continuing to pursue socialist expansion as a strategic objective. Legal declarations and strategic intent aren't the same thing. Conflating them is a category error that policymakers have paid for before.
The analogy that best captures this dynamic isn't a Cold War relic, but a recent and structurally precise precedent. In February 2022, Russia formally recognized the so-called Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics as independent states, 2 days before launching its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. That recognition was a legal mechanism engineered to reframe what would otherwise be a war of aggression against a sovereign neighbor as a response to an interstate request for assistance, and to strip away the political inhibition of attacking what Moscow had long called a fraternal nation. By declaring we are no longer one people, Russia converted potential fratricide into a justifiable conflict between states. The invasion followed within 48 hours. Legal declarations and strategic intent aren't the same thing. Pyongyang has been watching. In Pyongyang's case, reframing South Korea as a principal enemy serves several simultaneous purposes. It provides legal and ideological cover for rejecting any humanitarian or political engagement that might expose North Koreans to direct comparisons with the South, comparisons that, as noted above, are already eroding the regime's credibility. It silences domestic critics who might invoke the logic of South Koreans are our compatriots to object to coercive policies. And critically, it creates a doctrinal basis for treating military action against South Korea not as fratricidal war among the same people, but as armed conflict between two hostile states, a distinction with profound psychological and propagandistic weight in a system whose legitimacy rests partly on Korean nationalistic appeals. One counterargument holds that Kim eliminated unification from the Constitution to prevent absorption by a wealthier South, an act of regime self-preservation, not strategic repositioning. There is logic here, but it can't account for one inconvenient fact. North Korea's revision is unilateral. Article 4 of the South Korean Constitution remains unchanged and binding. The Republic of Korea shall seek unification, and Kim Jong-un has no power to amend it. The absorption threat isn't in Pyongyang's documents. Removing it from his own constitution eliminates a domestic constraint on his freedom of action, not the threat itself. Kim is still playing the game. He's only cleared the board of the pieces that were limiting his own moves. None of this requires that Kim has genuinely accepted a permanently divided peninsula.
It requires only that he has reframed his ambitions in terms that suit his current strategic position: a nuclear-armed state with an asymmetric military posture, a deepened partnership with Moscow, and a South Korean government that can't credibly threaten regime change. If this reading is correct, then what follows for Allied strategy is significant. Start with extended deterrence. If North Korea's nuclear weapons are now constitutionally positioned as tools available at Kim's personal discretion in the Korean theater, not merely as a last resort counter to U.S. homeland strikes, the deterrence calculus for the U.S. South Korean alliance requires serious re-examination. The long-standing debate about whether the American nuclear umbrella credibly covers theater-level nuclear use, as opposed to strategic strikes on the continental United States, has just gotten considerably more urgent. That urgency flows directly into how Seoul thinks about its own military strategy. South Korea has invested heavily in its kill chain and Korea massive punishment and retaliation capabilities, built around the logic of preemptive strikes against North Korean nuclear infrastructure and command notes. But if nuclear release authority is now concentrated in a single individual, Seoul's declaratory strategy must evolve accordingly. It needs to make unmistakably clear that the person who holds nuclear release authority will be targeted before a strike, during one, or immediately after. Equally important, a sophisticated psychological warfare campaign must run in parallel, one designed to drive a wedge between Kim and the broader North Korean elite, signaling to generals, party officials, and security chiefs that their fates need not be bound to the decisions of one man with personal nuclear authority. This is not speculation. I served in that system, as part of the elite networks that surround it. The one thing I can tell you with certainty is this: the men around Kim Jong-un are not true believers. They are calculators, and calculators respond to changed odds. The third implication extends beyond the peninsula entirely. Beijing has long calculated that a nuclear-armed North Korea is an uncomfortable but manageable buffer. Kim's constitutional consolidation of personal nuclear authority, combined with his deepening reliance on Moscow, represents a partial decoupling from Chinese influence that Beijing hasn't yet fully reckoned with. A North Korea constitutionally empowered to act unilaterally in a peninsular conflict is a qualitatively different problem from the one China thought it was managing. That miscalculation may prove to be Beijing's most consequential blind spot in Northeast Asia. Beneath all of this lies a more fundamental point. North Korea's nuclear program is, at its core, a personal survival guarantee for Kim Jong-un. His deepest fear is not military defeat or regime collapse. It is direct kinetic action against himself. The constitutional provision mandating automatic nuclear retaliation if the supreme leadership is struck must be read in this light. Whether such a system is technically real or even feasible is unknowable from the outside, but the declaration's purpose is clear. It is designed to convince Washington and Seoul that any attempt to remove Kim personally triggers nuclear war. Not a war plan, but a threat engineered to induce paralysis. When 3 U.S. nuclear-powered aircraft carriers converged simultaneously on the Korean peninsula in November 2017, Kim walked out for direct talks with President Donald Trump within months, not because of diplomatic overtures, but because he felt a credible and direct threat to his own survival. When that fear was real, he chose the table. The conclusion is not complicated. It is not concessions that move this regime. It is the credible threat that reaches Kim where he is most vulnerable. None of this demands despair. External variables retain real capacity to shift Pyongyang's calculations. The trajectory of the U.S.-Iran conflict, the sustainability of Russian material support for Pyongyang, North Korea's internal economic deterioration, and China's evolving leverage all remain live factors. If Kim's financial position worsens and the Russian partnership fails to deliver as expected, he may once again find himself in need of the economic oxygen that only inter-Korean engagement or international diplomacy can provide. The history of North Korean foreign policy is a history of tactical reversals in service of consistent strategic objectives. Seoul and Washington would be prudent to focus on the following question: what combination of credible deterrence, alliance cohesion, psychological pressure, and carefully structured incentives can persuade Pyongyang that the costs of nuclear coercion are prohibitive and that some form of negotiated stability serves its survival interests better than the next escalatory gambit?
That's a harder conversation than declaring the death of Korean reunification and moving on, but it is the accurate one. Hyun Seng Lee is a North Korean escapee, lead strategist at the Global Peace Foundation, and founder of the North Korean Young Leaders Assembly. A former sergeant in North Korea's Army Special Forces, he also served as chairman of the Kim Il-sung Socialist Youth League in Dalian, China, before his escape. He is a guest contributor to UPI's Korea Regional Review and holds a Master of Public Administration from Columbia University. Image, KCNA.